Hey friends, now before we get into today's video, I wanted to do a little disclaimer right at the start that you will disagree with this video. Everybody will. And I fully expect lots of people to leave comments telling me why I'm wrong on this video, as what I'm going to give today is my top 10 list of my personal top 10 operating systems of all time. Now the reason I've done this video is, obviously on this channel I've done lots of videos about different operating systems over the years, and often in the comments people will ask me, what's my favorite OS, or what are your top 5? So I thought I'd put that together in a video, and I will admit it's actually been harder to do than I thought, and in the process of writing this video over the last week I've juggled things around in the top 10 more times than I can even remember now. And if you ask me tomorrow, chances are I would give you a completely different list. So it does change by the day, and I welcome your input as well. Tell me your favorite operating systems. But for a little bit of inspiration, I actually posted the question, what's your favorite operating system? Name 5 or 10 on various Facebook groups that I'm in, on different forums, on Twitter, to get some inspiration and maybe jog my memory for different OSs that I've maybe forgotten about. But really, most of this list is going to be my personal choice. Now, I've based it mainly on personal computer operating systems, as I didn't want to get stuff like, Unix in there, which is far too vague, I think, or BSD, or even, stuff like VMS that ran on mainframes. But really, I wanted this to be a list of operating systems I've used, and ones that are going to be, appeal to a mainstream computer audience, I thought. But also, they're going to be operating systems that I've judged on different merits. For example, some of the OSs that you'll see here are based purely on their technological advancements, the great tech that was in there. Some of them will be based on how they shape the marketplace and the influence that they've had on the PC industry as a whole. So get ready to disagree with me, get ready to throw something at the monitor, no doubt, as I get through this list, and get ready to tell me your favourite operating systems in the comments. But here are, for now, my top 10 operating systems of all time. Enjoy. Now we'll start at number 10 with GEOS, which actually deserves its place on this list as it was an incredibly impressive feat back in its day, running a full early Mac-like graphical user interface on the humble Commodore 64. Developed by Berkeley Softworks, GEOS was initially released in 1986 and included, bundled with it, a graphical word processor called GeoWrite, a paint program, GeoPaint, and you could get a desktop publishing package called GeoPublish. There was a spreadsheet application called, you're spotting a theme, GeoCalc, and there was lots of third-party software made for it too. And it supported the Commodore 1351 mouse, and you could do disk management with it as well. You could even use a floppy disk as virtual memory. GEOS was developed until 1989, and Commodore actually bundled it with their later Commodore 64C packages, and there were versions made for the Apple II, the Commodore 128, and the Commodore Plus 4. Berkeley later developed a successor called GeoWorks for PCs, but GEOS finds its place on this list because it was such a jaw-dropping achievement, bringing full graphical desktop power to the lowly Commodore 64, and the fact that it really did give this system a whole new lease of life. CPM, Control Program Monitor, or later Control Program from Microcomputers, is regarded by many as the first operating system for microprocessors. And it certainly was one of the earliest microcomputer operating systems and the first dominant PC standard. First released in 1974, CPM quickly became the most popular small computer OS in the late 1970s. With support for the Z80 CPU, the Intel 8080 and 8086, Motorola 68K and others as well, it could run on various hardware configurations, meaning that it was one of the earliest standards for personal computer operating systems. Developed by Gary Kildall, he started working on CPM when he was a consultant for Intel, aiming it at their Intellec 8 machine. When it was completed, Gary offered to sell it to the company, who at the time, in 1974, Intel were not interested in a disk operating system and turned down his offer to buy the entire thing for just $20,000. Gary then started his own company, Digital Research, to sell CPM. Now, the operating system was based on 3 parts: a BIOS, a disk operating system, and a command line. And if CPM was so widely used, why are we not using a derivative of it today? Well, it's thanks to a little company called Microsoft who came along with their PC-DOS system, which IBM used on their PC computer and of course went on to become the industry standard. The story goes that Gary Kildall actually had a meeting scheduled with IBM before they met with Bill Gates, and unfortunately he missed this really important meeting as he was a plane enthusiast and took his wife flying on her birthday, leaving the door open for PC-DOS, later to be known as MS-DOS, and then Windows, to completely take over the market, with CP/M being discontinued in 1983. For the full story on that tragic tale, you can check out the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 46, where we were joined by Stuart Chaffee, who was very close to Gary, being his co-host on the Computer Chronicles. And even though CP/M lost the marketplace war, it does deserve its place in the top 10 for being one of the earliest standards that went on to pave the way for the systems that we all use today. Now, most of this list is an overall family of operating systems. I haven't singled out many individual versions, but I do think that Windows 2000 deserves to be a bit of an exception. Following on from Windows NT 4, many regard Windows 2000 as the pinnacle of Windows development. To start with, 2000 was compatible with many more systems than NT 4, meaning that it opened up Windows NT to the masses and added some of the best features from Windows 98, including plug and play, USB support, and it had other features like being fully 32-bit, it had memory protection, and it was a big bonus that it wasn't built on the creaky, bloated MS-DOS foundation. And this meant that it was incredibly efficient for a Windows operating system, and they included the application compatibility kit, which meant it opened the door for you to run a lot of DOS and Windows 98 software on it. Windows 2000 was rock solid, fast and responsive, and for many people it was the first version of Windows that was actually a pleasure to use. BeOS was the revolution that never happened. Led by former head of Macintosh development at Apple, Jean-Louis Gasset, BeOS was an attempt to reinvent the operating system and leave behind all of the clunky 70s legacy that was inside the other operating systems on the market. Frustrated at the decades of bloat and forced backwards compatibility in the world of Windows and macOS, the team at B wanted to completely make a new operating system platform from scratch, designed for the 21st century. And BeOS was designed with media and graphics in mind, which of course became increasingly important as we moved into the 2000s. The entire system was built from the ground up with multitasking and hardware acceleration to give it enough grunt to run some very impressive demos for the time. The B-Box hardware was based on the PowerPC architecture, which Apple were also in the process of moving over to in 1995. And this was no coincidence, as behind the scenes, Jean-Louis Gasset knew that Apple were in deep trouble at the time. In the mid-90s, Apple was a complete mess, and they were trying to develop their own in-house next-generation operating system, the ill-fated Copeland OS, which ended up being cancelled after a couple of years of development. When it was rumoured that Apple were instead looking to purchase another company for their operating system technology, Gasset assumed that BeOS was the only logical choice. And in fact, Apple did offer B Inc. $125 million to purchase the company, which B actually refused, thinking that Apple had no other options and would have to offer more. Unfortunately for B, there was another option. Instead, Apple purchased Steve Jobs' NeXT computers, which then they used as a foundation for the new macOS and, of course, meant the return of Steve Jobs to the company, leaving BeOS stood up at the altar. B did try to get some market share by getting out of the hardware business and then release BeOS as a standalone operating system that could run on standard PCs and Macs. BeOS 5 could even run as an application from within Windows 95. Sadly, sales declined and this revolutionary OS faded into obscurity. Today, BeOS does live on as the open source Haiku OS, which has actually just gone into Beta 2 release at the time of recording this video, and continues the BeOS legacy. Now, I must admit, it does pain me that MS-DOS makes its place in the top 10, because I'll be honest, I've never been a fan of it, but it's undeniable what an impact it made on the industry, and how much input it had into the growth of the personal computer industry as a whole. Following on from the CP/M story that we were talking about earlier, due to some very shrewd and some may say, quite frankly, underhanded business decisions at Microsoft, MS-DOS allowed Microsoft to become the de facto operating system supplier of PCs since the mid-80s. After doing a deal with IBM to supply BASIC and the operating system for their new PC platform, Microsoft didn't actually have their own operating system, so instead they purchased a CP/M-inspired OS called 86DOS, originally known as QDOS or Quick and Dirty Operating System, from a company called Seattle Computer Products for $50,000. They then modified it to become PC-DOS, which they later rebranded to MS-DOS. And this decision wasn't without its controversy. There are actually claims that PC-DOS contained some code from CP/M, which was denied by its original author Tim Patterson. And in fact, when a 2004 book claimed that QDOS was a rip-off of CP/M, he attempted to sue the book publishers for defamation, although the case was thrown out of court for being an opinion. MS-DOS was the primary operating system for the IBM PC and the massive clone market that sprung up in the 80s and 90s, and of course became the foundation for Windows until the late 90s. And I continue surprising myself with this list. I can't believe that Windows makes an appearance twice in the top 10, but it can't be denied the change and innovation that Windows 95 brought to the general PC market. And you have to remember, it was the first time that we'd seen people lining up for the midnight release of a piece of software, and it was something that was previously only considered interesting to hardcore computer nerds. They were lining up at midnight to buy an operating system. The launch of Windows 95 really was something else, hyped up with a $300 million marketing campaign, $3 million of which went to license the Rolling Stones Start Me Up song to announce the innovative new start menu. They had, of course, the cheesy sitcom to promote it with the biggest TV stars of the day, Jennifer Aniston and Matthew Perry from Friends, of course, and there were launch events all around the world, with the main one in America being hosted by another big star of mid-90s TV, Jay Leno. No expense was spared with the launch of Windows 95. And it's hard to remember just what a step forward Windows 95 was over Windows 3.1. Of course, we have the start menu that still lives on today. We'll ignore Windows 8. Proper multitasking, long file name support, plug and play to automatically detect new hardware and to try and leave behind the days of IRQ and DMA conflicts. And there was a Plus pack, which was the first version of Internet Explorer, which was many people's first introduction to the World Wide Web. The lasting influence and change that Windows 95 made to the IT industry really can't be overstated, and it brought with it features and user interface elements that we still use today, 25 years later. Now again, I've actually picked out a specific version of another operating system for my top 10. Mac OS, as it's known as today, is my daily driver OS, so I know my way around it really well, and I've actually used OS X since its earliest days as OS 10.0 Cheetah when I found it on a Power Mac that was installed at college, but my first Mac was an iBook G3 running Jaguar. But it was the release of OS X 10.4 Tiger that I thought the operating system really came into its own. You have to remember that initially, OS X was very buggy, and it felt really slow on the hardware that it was released for. Having to merge together Next and Apple technologies wasn't a simple job, and Macs were actually bundled with OS 9 and OS X together for a couple of years until the new operating system was considered mature enough to take over. For me, that moment came with Tiger, and it really was a landmark release of OS X. It finally felt fast and responsive enough and brought with it features that we still use today, like the amazing Spotlight and Automator, and also it was the final version of OS X to feature OS 9 backwards compatibility, the classic mode, meaning that you could run all your legacy OS 9 apps as well. Now, I've used OS X for 20 years, and while it is still my OS of choice, it can't be denied that the Mac OS of today does suffer quite a bit of bloat, and it is becoming more like the mobile iOS by the year with every new release. A lesson that Apple could learn from Windows 8 maybe, trying to cram mobile and tablet features together onto a desktop operating system generally doesn't work all that well. But Mac OS X Tiger for me was the pinnacle of efficiency and new features bundled in a streamlined OS from Apple. Now, regular viewers of my channel will not be surprised that Amiga OS makes this list, although I'm sure many of you would expect me to place it at number 1. But it can't be denied that Amiga OS was a total revolution when it was introduced back in 1985. Of course, it was based on a preemptive multitasking kernel called exec, and it was the first time that many home users had ever experienced a multitasking operating system before. You have to remember that back then, it was common, for example, to print a document from your word processor and have to sit there while your machine was locked up, waiting for the document to finish before you could continue using your machine. But with Amiga OS, you could print the document and carry on using your system as normal, even launching other programs and continuing to get your work done. Not to mention, you could have multiple screens of different resolutions all open at the same time that the user could seamlessly drag between. And throughout subsequent versions, Amiga OS introduced other great features, such as data types, which theoretically meant that any program could read any type of file without the application having to know about it. For example, if your Paint package didn't read GIF files, all you'd have to do is install a GIF data type, and now it can. And of course, a new format came along called PNG or PNG that maybe came out after your DTP package was released. Well, all you need to do is download the PNG data type, and now your existing programs can work with the format. All the user had to do is download a small data type file, and then all data type aware applications on their system could take advantage of and understand the new format. And we had AREX support built in, and loads of programs released after around 1991 supported it, meaning the user could automate many processes and even batch command various programs to work together. And we are just scratching the surface of the revolutionary features that came in Amiga OS. And of course today, it does still survive for its niche army of Amiga fans, admittedly in a very fragmented way, with the latest version, Amiga OS 3.1.4, being released in 2018, and spin-off OSs like Amiga OS 4 for PowerPC boards, and MorphOS and the open source AROS project, all coming out of the Amiga OS family tree. When Steve Jobs was ousted from Apple after launching the Macintosh, he started his own company in 1985 called Next. And they introduced a series of high-end personal computers and workstations aimed at education, design and business use. And whilst Next as a hardware manufacturer wasn't a major success, in fact some people put estimates of their sales at around 50,000 units in total, the operating system that powered their machines was extremely impressive. Based on the Mach kernel and BSD, this Unix operating system is the grandfather to the modern macOS, iOS, iPadOS, watchOS and the Apple TV's tvOS. And it had some really cutting-edge features for the time, including using PostScript for its windowing engine. It was heavily object-orientated with an OO application layer, Objective-C runtime kit and some extremely impressive development tools. NeXTSTEP also introduced the idea of the dock for launching applications. We saw 3D style windows and icons for the first time, system-wide drag and drop for objects, and real-time scrolling and window dragging. NeXTSTEP was also the OS of choice at id Software, and they used it to develop games like Doom and Quake. And Tim Berners-Lee developed a little thing called the World Wide Web using NeXTSTEP at CERN back in 1989. So I'm sure there have been some surprising inclusions in my top 9 list so far, but which operating system am I going to place at number 1? What do I think deserves the title of the best personal computer operating system of all time? Well, we'll find out in just a minute. Now, before we do that, I just wanted to take a quick second to give a big thank you to my very good friends at NordVPN who've brought this video to you. Now, you may have heard about VPNs before and how they can help protect your privacy and make it seem like you're connecting from other countries around the world. But there are some nightmare stories about some VPN services selling your data to ad companies, which is why NordVPN is highly recommended and actually offers double encryption technology. So this means your internet traffic goes via 2 VPN servers, the second of which is totally unaware of your original IP address. And they reroute your internet connection through their super fast servers, meaning that you're fully protected at all times. Even when you're traveling, you might be on public Wi-Fi at coffee shops or at the airport. And NordVPN works with most operating systems and devices. You can install it on your smartphone, it's got unlimited bandwidth, no data login, and there really is no excuse for you not to be using it. And I love how fast NordVPN is as well. I just leave it on in the background, often even forget that I've got it running, and they improve your online experience with their CyberSec suite. Now this blocks ads and protects you from malware and other online threats. So you can protect your online activity today with the only VPN to get all the green checks on PC Mag. Now NordVPN have been kind enough to support this channel, so if you enjoy my content, please support them back. So this is what I want you to do. Take advantage of this amazing offer that they've given us and get 68% off the normal price of a NordVPN subscription. So that means it works out at just $3.71 a month, and they've generously given you an additional month completely free. So all you have to do is visit this website right now, nordvpn.com/danwood, nordvpn.com/danwood, and use my name so they know that I sent you as your exclusive promo code and claim this massive discount. Just enter Danwood in the promo code box, thanks to our very good friends at NordVPN. So time to find out who is top of the heap, king of the castle, which operating system has made the #1 top spot on my top 10 operating systems list. Well, #1 goes to Linux. Now, this even surprised me, as someone who doesn't really consider myself to be much of a Linux user. Putting Linux at #1 on my best operating systems of all time list, I thought was a bit crazy at first, but actually the more I think about this, it really does deserve its place at the top. And Linux's main weakness is also its strength. Due to the fact that it's open source, the system can be tweaked, it can be modified by anyone at all for their own purposes, and this means there are currently estimated to be around 600 different Linux distributions in active development, which of course can be hugely confusing for new users, but also hugely beneficial. Because there are so many different flavours of Linux out there, you're bound to be able to find one that suits your tastes, and if not, well, just make your own. And you can often try out different Linux distributions from a live CD without changing anything on your machine. And you can get Linux distributions that are as simple to install as Windows or Mac OS, or you can make it as complicated or as custom as you like. And beyond desktop use, of course Linux is the root of systems like Android, it runs on most web servers in the world. Chances are the server you're streaming this on right now from YouTube is running on Linux. Most of the fastest supercomputers in the world run on Linux. Even the Large Hadron Collider at CERN uses Linux to process all of its massive amounts of data. You'll find it on games consoles, on smart TVs, on phones, retro computers. There are multimedia rich distros with gigabytes of pre-installed applications. There are tiny Linux installs that can run resident in RAM in just a few megabytes. In-flight entertainment on planes, smart fridges, washing machines, the list goes on. Linux is literally the operating system that has no boundaries. And for that reason, I think it deserves its place at the top of my list for being the best operating system ever made. So there you go, maybe my most controversial video of all time. I'm sure that no one's going to agree with this list, definitely not in its entirety. It would be interesting to find out maybe your favourite of all time, or even your top 5 if you leave a comment. Nice to find out a little reason why as well, but hopefully you enjoyed this. Thank you for watching. And if you've enjoyed this video on YouTube, why don't you check out my weekly retro gaming podcast, The Retro Hour, where we bring you up to date on the retro gaming and tech stories of the week, and we're joined by an amazing guest on the show every week. You can get it every Friday from wherever you normally get your podcasts from, or head to the website theretrohour.com. And while you're here on YouTube, here's another video you might enjoy. I'll see you next time.